October 25th, 1854. A hillside above the port of Balaclava, Crimea. Sir Colin Campbell rides slowly along a line of 550 Scottish Highlanders and looks his men in the eye. Behind them, the harbour. Behind the harbour, everything the British Army in Crimea needs to survive. Food, ammunition, medicine, winter clothing. In front of them, several hundred Russian hussars are coming over the ridge. Campbell has no cavalry, no reserves, no second line. The Ottoman troops who were supposed to hold the outer defences have broken and fled. His Highland regiment is all that stands between the Russian horsemen and the total destruction of the British war effort in Crimea. He rides the length of his line and delivers his order in a voice that carries across the hillside. "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." And from the ranks, one voice answers for all of them. "Aye, Sir Colin, and need be, we'll do that." This is the story of the thin red line, the morning when 500 Scotsmen, armed with the most advanced rifle in the world, stood in a formation that broke every rule of military doctrine and stopped the finest light cavalry in Europe in its tracks. The day that proved firepower had made shock warfare obsolete and created one of the most enduring images in British military history. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into the Battle of Balaclava. Not the disaster of the Light Brigade that history remembers, but the extraordinary defensive stand that saved the entire campaign. Because before the famous charge that Tennyson immortalised, a Scottish regiment performed something tactically more significant and strategically far more important. They held the line when no one else could. But before we get to those Highlanders on the hillside, before we watch minier rifle fire tear through Russian cavalry at ranges that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, we need to understand how Britain ended up in Crimea at all, and why losing the harbour of Balaclava would have meant losing everything. And if you enjoy this kind of history, the battles behind the famous battles, the moments of individual courage that decided campaigns, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the engagements that built Britain's military reputation, from medieval bowmen to Victorian redcoats. Let us go back to 1853, when the Eastern Question, the slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and what would fill the vacuum, brought the great powers of Europe to the brink of war. The ostensible cause was religious. Russia demanded the right to protect Orthodox Christians living within the Ottoman Empire, including access to the holy sites of Jerusalem. When the Ottomans refused and French influence prevailed in the Holy Land instead, Tsar Nicholas I moved troops into Ottoman-controlled Wallachia and Moldavia. For Britain, this was not primarily a religious question at all. It was a strategic one. Russian expansion toward the Black Sea and the Mediterranean threatened the trade routes to India, the commercial lifelines of empire. If Russia crushed the Ottomans and established herself as the dominant power from the Baltic to the Bosphorus, the balance of European power, carefully maintained since Napoleon, would collapse. A Russia that controlled Constantinople controlled the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. A Russia that controlled that gateway could dictate terms to every merchant fleet and every navy operating in the eastern seas. This Britain would not permit. Britain and France declared war on Russia in March 1854. Their strategic objective was direct: destroy the Russian naval base at Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, the port from which Russian warships threatened Ottoman control of the Black Sea. Without Sevastopol's fleet, Russia's ability to project power southward would be crippled. The Allied expedition landed in September 1854, defeated the Russians at the Battle of the Alma, and began the siege of Sevastopol. It was supposed to be over quickly. Sevastopol would fall in weeks, the fleet would be destroyed, and the Allies would return home before winter. Military operations rarely honour their planners' optimism, and Crimea was no exception. The Russians defended Sevastopol with extraordinary tenacity. The siege settled into a grinding stalemate, and the autumn of 1854 brought the campaign's first genuine crisis. What followed was a masterclass in military logistics failure. The French had chosen the deep, sheltered bay of Crimea as their supply port. Spacious, easily defended, well positioned. The British commander Lord Raglan chose Balaclava. It was a narrow fjord-like harbour, barely large enough for the fleet, set at the bottom of a valley surrounded by hills, separated from the British siege lines by miles of difficult terrain. It was in short a logistical nightmare, but it was deep enough for large ships, and Raglan chose it. Balaclava was the army's lifeline. Every shell for the siege guns, every biscuit for the soldiers, every boot and every blanket came through that harbour. Lose Balaclava and the British army in Crimea starved. The Russians understood this perfectly. General Pavel Liprandi, commanding the Russian forces in the area, planned a strike designed to sever what he correctly identified as the campaign's critical vulnerability. To protect Balaclava, the British had established a series of defensive redoubts, earthwork fortifications, along the causeway heights, the ridge that divided the North Valley from the South Valley and controlled the approaches to the port. These redoubts were garrisoned not by British troops, who were needed in the siege lines, but by Ottoman soldiers, mostly Tunisian colonial infantry. Brave, experienced men who had one critical problem. They had been left undersupplied and unsupported. Their defensive works were incomplete, and they had been told help would come if they were attacked. Help did not come. In the grey pre-dawn of October 25th, Liprandi unleashed his attack. Russian artillery opened on the causeway redoubts before first light. The Ottoman garrison of Redoubt No. 1, 500 or 600 men under a Turkish commander who fought with considerable courage, held as long as they could. When their ammunition ran low and no British cavalry appeared to support them, they were overwhelmed. Redoubt No. 1 fell. The other redoubts, seeing no prospect of relief, concluded that isolated resistance was suicide and withdrew. The British cavalry, watching from the valley below, did nothing. Lord Lucan, commanding the cavalry division, had received no orders to support the redoubts and refused to act without them. The Ottoman retreat became a rout when Russian Cossacks swept in pursuit, riding down men too exhausted to resist. To the British soldiers watching from below, it was a disturbing sight, their outer defensive line dissolving in what looked like panic. In the harbour below, urgent messages were already flying. Balaclava was being attacked. The town of Kadikoy, the village that sat astride the single road connecting the harbour to the main army, was directly threatened, and between the approaching Russian cavalry and the harbour, there was almost nothing, except Sir Colin Campbell and the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders. Campbell was everything the aristocratic British officer establishment was not. Born in Glasgow, the son of a carpenter, he had earned every step of his career through 40 years of continuous service. He had fought in the Peninsular War under Wellington, learning from the master what disciplined infantry properly handled could achieve. He had served in the War of 1812 in North America, in China during the First Opium War, in the Punjab during the Sikh Wars. Every campaign had added something to his understanding of soldiers and battle. He knew how men behaved when they were frightened, because he had watched it for 4 decades. He knew how to hold them together. His soldiers called him Old Careful, a tribute to his habit of looking after his men's welfare, of never wasting lives on avoidable risks, of inspecting their food and their boots as carefully as he inspected their musketry. Where other commanders sent men forward recklessly and counted the casualties afterward, Campbell calculated his risks in advance and minimised them without surrendering his objectives. He was 61 years old at Balaclava and had spent his entire adult life preparing for moments precisely like this one. His position on the morning of October 25th was precarious in the extreme. He had the 93rd Highlanders, approximately 550 men in fighting condition. He had a battery of artillery under Captain Barker. He had some Royal Marines on the heights above the harbour. He had the remains of the Ottoman troops who had not fled entirely, perhaps 100 men whom Campbell personally stopped, shamed and rallied back into line. And he had, in a cruel irony, about 100 sick and convalescent soldiers from the hospital. Men deemed too unwell for frontline duty, who now found themselves on what was about to become the front line. What he did not have was any conventional means of stopping a cavalry charge. Military doctrine in 1854 was unambiguous. Infantry caught in the open by cavalry formed a square. The infantry square, a dense block of men presenting bayonets in every direction, was the standard response to mounted attack. Horses would not charge into a solid wall of steel. The square had been the salvation of European infantry for 2 centuries. Campbell chose not to form a square. He kept his Highlanders in a line, just 2 ranks deep, stretched across the hillside above Kadikoy. It was, by the standards of the day, a remarkable gamble. A line too deep was far more vulnerable to being overlapped and surrounded than a square. If the Russian cavalry swung around either flank, the Highlanders would be cut apart. But a square had a different problem. It presented a compact target to artillery, and concentrated men could be reached by Russian cavalry after they had ridden around the flanks. Campbell needed to cover as much ground as possible to prevent encirclement. He trusted his men's discipline. He trusted the rifle they carried. The Patton 1851 Minié rifle was among the most significant military technologies of the mid-19th century. Its predecessors, the smooth-bore muskets that had equipped European armies for 200 years, were effective at roughly 100 yards. Beyond that, a musket ball was as likely to miss its target entirely as hit it. This limitation had shaped tactics for generations. Armies had to approach each other to close range before volley fire became decisive, which meant cavalry shock attacks at full gallop were still a genuine military option. The Minié rifle changed everything. Its rifled barrel and elongated conical bullet, designed to expand on firing and grip the grooves of the barrel, gave it an effective range of 800 to 1,000 yards. Not 200, not even 400, 800 yards. A cavalry charge that began at that range gave the defending infantry time for multiple volleys before the horsemen arrived. It meant that the mathematical equation of shock versus firepower had fundamentally shifted. Campbell knew it. His regiment had trained with these weapons. Now, on a hillside in Crimea, the theory was about to be tested. General Ivan Rizhov's cavalry detachment, between 400 and 600 hussars of the Ingermanland regiment, came over the ridge and saw below them, across the slope toward the harbour, a thin line of red-coated soldiers. Just 2 ranks, no square, no apparent depth. To an experienced cavalry officer, this looked either like a trap or an opportunity. The Highlanders standing in that thin line saw something different. Russian horsemen, swords drawn, beginning to move toward them. The morning was cold, their breath misted in the October air. Some of the younger soldiers, nerves taut to breaking point, began to press forward, instinct pulling them toward the enemy, towards the relief of action. Campbell roared them back into line with an energy that his decades of experience had perfectly calibrated. 93rd, damn your eagerness, stay where you stand. Rizhov's cavalry came on, moving at a controlled canter rather than a full gallop. The terrain was too broken, too covered in vineyards and scrub for the thundering charge of cavalry legend. They were still hundreds of yards away when Campbell gave the order to fire. The first volley crashed out at long range, 600 yards or more by most accounts. The effect on Rizhov's men was not annihilation but shock. Riders fell. Horses screamed. Gaps appeared in the Russian line at a range where no infantry fire had ever reached them before. The hussars did not break, but they wavered. They pressed on. The second volley hit them at closer range, and this time Captain Barker's artillery joined in from the heights, and the Marines added their fire from the hillside above the harbour. The combination of rifle fire at ranges the Russians had never anticipated, supported by guns on their flanks, created a killing zone that their training had not prepared them for. Rizhov scanned the ground ahead. He could not see the end of the British line. The Highlanders' formation was too extended. He suspected reserves might be concealed in the ground beyond. The fire was too heavy, too disciplined, too effective at ranges that made no sense to a cavalry officer schooled in the tactics of a previous era. He pulled his men back. It was over in minutes. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders had not lost a single man killed. A handful were wounded. The Russian cavalry disappeared back over the ridge toward the North Valley, where the rest of the morning's drama would unfold. The heavy brigade's magnificent charge, and then the catastrophic destruction of the light brigade in the valley that Tennyson would make immortal. But it was the Highlanders on the hillside who had saved the campaign. Watching from a vantage point on the heights above, William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent who was in the process of inventing modern war journalism, scribbled in his notebook. He wrote of the Russian cavalry bearing down on the Highlanders, and of the line that held. His phrase was modest enough in the original, a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. His editors, recognising its power, tightened it to something permanent. The thin red line entered the language and stayed there. Robert Gibb painted it in 1881, 27 years after the fact. His canvas shows the Highlanders at close range, the Russians almost upon them, the bayonets gleaming. It is magnificent and largely inaccurate. The Russians were much further away, the terrain was rougher, the moment less cinematic than Gibb's oil paint suggests. But the painting fixed the image in the popular mind with a completeness that no accurate representation could have matched. The thin red line became the visual shorthand for British steadiness under pressure, for the capacity of trained, disciplined soldiers to stand when everything tells them to run. What the painting and the phrase conceal is the technology that made the stand possible. Campbell was not performing a miracle of pure courage. He was executing a cold, tactical calculation that the mini-air rifle's range had so fundamentally altered the balance between infantry and cavalry that two ranks of well-trained Highlanders could do what 100 years of doctrine said required a square formation. The bravery was real, the steadiness was remarkable, but the rifle was the weapon that made it work. There is another element that the legend consistently overlooks: the Ottoman soldiers who held Redoubt No. 1 until they had no ammunition left, and who were cut down in their retreat by Cossacks while the British cavalry watched and did nothing. History has not been generous to the Ottoman garrison of the Causeway Heights. The British press called them cowards. The soldiers who survived had been abandoned, undersupplied, unsupported, their defensive works incomplete, and fought under conditions that the Highlanders never faced. Their sacrifice bought time. Without it, Rizov's cavalry might have reached Kadikoy before Campbell was in position. For Campbell himself, Balaclava was the beginning of a final chapter of distinction. He would go on to command British forces in India during the Mutiny of 1857, relieving Lucknow in one of the most celebrated campaigns of the Victorian era. He was made a Field Marshal and Baron Clyde before his death in 1863. The sergeant's son from Glasgow had risen as high as the British army could take a man. His regiment marched home from Crimea to Scotland, to the pipes and the welcome of a nation that had read Russell's dispatches and seen Gibb's painting and understood, with the instinct that nations develop for their own stories, that something extraordinary had happened on that hillside. Not just a tactical success, not just a battle won, a demonstration of what British soldiers could do when led by a commander who understood them, equipped with weapons that gave their discipline the range to matter, facing an enemy who had not yet understood that the world had changed. The thin red line stands in British memory, not because it was the greatest victory, or the largest battle, or the most dramatic charge. It stands because it captures something true about what British military culture believed itself to be. Steady where others broke, professional where others panicked, capable of holding a line with two ranks, and a rifle, and a general who told his men to die where they stood, and meant it, and knew they would. The hillside above Balaclava is quiet now, the vineyards are gone, the redoubts are grassed over, but the equation that Campbell proved still holds. Discipline and firepower, properly combined, can stop anything. On October 25, 1854, 550 Highlanders proved it on a Crimean hillside, and the world has not forgotten. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered told the way they deserved.